That's good.
Everybody mute, 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 mute.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. Today is Saturday, February 1st, 2020. I'm Bob Diebold, Vice Chairman of the Committee for the Global Endeavor. Today, we continue with Phase 6 and the 29th webinar in our series of webinars on the topic, Comparing and Contrasting the True Teachings of Jesus with the Traditional Tenets and Practices of Organized Institutional Christianity. This is topic 8 in the study guide called Revelation Revealed. Neil Waldrop is its author and also the chairman of the committee. I'm now turning the webinar over to Neil now. Neil, over to you.
Thank you, Bob. I welcome the opportunity to be with you today and with our other colleagues. We are indeed continuing our series of discussions. I do have to report a conversation with one fellow reader of the Urantia book who said that he was a Christian, but he thought that his religion was rather disorganized. And so did our discussions include him by implication? I assured him that the term organized institutional religion is meant as a collective. And if he feels his denomination is disorganized, that's a judgment for him to make, not for me. In any case, we are continuing. And for those of our viewers who may not be familiar with our process, I would state that the basic framework is my long discussion document, Revelation Revealed, which I wrote in the middle of 2016. At the moment, however, we are basically considering an addendum, an additional text that accompanies Revelation Revealed. The additional text is called Living the Real Religion of Jesus, and that is what we will focus on today. Now, for any of you who do not have these texts, then I recommend that you download them from the website of the Committee for the Global Endeavor. The website is as follows: www.globalendeavor.net. I say again, www.globalendeavor.net. The most important document is my essay, Living the Real Religion of Jesus, and you will find it near the bottom of the list on the homepage that I have just mentioned. Now, because there's no possibility for any of you viewing us today to ask questions while we are talking, we offer you an option. You could send us in a question by email message. If you wish to do that, you would use the email address that is listed at the bottom of that homepage that I mentioned before. And the email address is as follows: info@globalendeavor.net. In all these cases, Global Endeavor is treated as a single word without punctuation in the middle and certainly without a space. Now, if we decide to use your question, we reserve the right to edit the wording. And in that event, during some future program, the entire panel of participants would consider your question and would answer it. You would not be getting just an answer from me. So now, having gone through all these procedural elements, I will turn to the substance of our discussion today, which pertains to the section on page 7 of my essay, Living the Real Religion of Jesus, that begins with the subtitle, The Presence of God. Last week, we began our discussion of the first paragraph on page 7, which is where we are. Because we did not complete our discussion of that paragraph, I would ask that a colleague read it again for us. Andrea, may I ask you to do that, please? The first paragraph following the subtitle, The Presence of God. You'll have to unmute yourself.
There I am. In the final analysis, is that where you'd like me to
Yes,
begin?
go ahead, please.
God is in, around, over, under, and through us. Although this includes the fact that a thought adjuster lives in the mind of each human being who is conscious of right and wrong, that definitely does not exhaust the reality of God's presence. After all, a divine counselor tells us in paper 1, quote, "In him we all live and move and have our being," unquote. On the other hand, in paper 5, he concedes, quote, "It is well nigh impossible for human logic and finite reason to harmonize the concept of divine immanence, God within and a part of every individual, with the idea of God's transcendence, the divine domination of the universe of universes," end quote, divine counselor. This may be as far as we should go, for this second statement suggests that attempting to probe the philosophic implications is not likely to be productive.
Thank you.
Nonetheless, do you want me to stop?
Yes, please. Thank you for reading that paragraph. Last week, you had a chance to comment on it and did, and George also. I would call to the attention of the others the fact that George mentioned the immediately succeeding sentence that follows the second quotation from the divine counselor that is embedded in the paragraph. And he believed that that additional sentence supplies very substantial additional insight. Therefore, I shall follow his lead and read that succeeding sentence now. This is taken from paragraph 6 in section 5 of paper 5. And it reads as follows: "These two essential concepts of deity must be unified in the faith grasp of the concept of the transcendence of a personal God and in the realization of the indwelling presence of a fragment of that God in order to justify intelligent worship and validate the hope of personality survival." So having added that very helpful additional quotation that George identified last week, I would now like to call on the others of you for your comments in regard to this paragraph or any of those ideas. Marvin, would you like to go ahead?
Yeah, Be glad to. I'm just looking at it. I like the addition that George requested, by the way, and I hope it gets added to the document. It's great. I would add one more as to the centrality of the immanence of God's presence in the theology of the Urantia book, and it's one of my favorite brief statements in the book that has profound theological implications and practical implications, and that is that the doing of the will of God is nothing more or less than an exhibition of creature willingness to share the inner life with God. That's a pretty striking statement as well. And the only other observation I would make is, well, it's a dual observation, and that is that this idea that God dwells within us and a great deal of detailed information on the nature of that indwelling, its implications, and what flows from it in terms of how we can proceed in life, like the sharing of the inner life, is a large part, plays a substantial part in the Urantia revelation. And in looking at the evolutionary traditions, I think in Hinduism, you've got the idea of the Atman, which is a concept of indwelling. But even in Christianity and many religions, that concept is not very well developed. In Christianity, the statement of the kingdom of heaven is within, but there isn't a lot of other detailed information. So I think it's a very significant addition in our religious climate that the Urantia book spends so much attention on the presence of God immanently within us, and that we are due to merge with it, fuse with it, and become one. It's got huge implications. So it's a matter of emphasis.
Thank you, Marvin. I'd like to pursue one of the thoughts that you shared with us and ask you to interpret your own thought. You cited the quotation about sharing one's inner life with God. Now, do you interpret that as sharing one's inner life with God immanent, or with God transcendent, or with both, perhaps?
Well, I think it's primarily immanent. I mean, when we're in dialogue with God, we may, in our own attitude, address God as exterior and universally present or transcendent. Actually, there's three levels. There's transcendent, meaning on paradise. There's omnipresent, meaning all around us, surrounding us, which is one sense of God immanent in a sense. And then there's God within us, which is yet another sense of the immanence of God. When they talk about sharing the inner life, that phrase to me is more the third. It's more an emphasis on the interior communion and an ongoing inner conversation and worshipful interaction with God's presence within. And I think it's largely with Jesus and the Mother Spirit and our angelic presences that we're engaged with God's action in our actual exterior environment that we can actually contact, meaning our lives and our social environments. So that's probably enough.
Thank you. Stephen, would you comment on the relative balance of attention that you perceive, at least in the Western tradition, to the idea that God is around us and in effect permeates all of reality, as opposed to the idea that he's in heaven somewhere on a throne?
Okay. Well, the quote that you used here, in him we all live and move and have our being, of course, that's taken from the New Testament, the book of Acts. That's why it has quotations around it. And I think, well, for instance, in early Christianity, they were struggling to somehow conceptualize these ideas. They didn't have the necessarily the logical or conceptual tools to articulate it the way it is in the Urantia book, but they were aware of the reality, even if the articulation was not as clear to our ears. For instance, when Paul talks about the body of Christ, that's something that is beyond any particular individual, but every individual who is a follower of Christ is in that body. So it's bigger than and outside of any particular individual, but every particular individual is within that body. At the same time, Paul talks about each person's body being the temple of God. And of course, in John's gospel, he talks about the inner light, which is the divine light, the divine spirit. So these various ideas of light and spirit and temple were, I guess we would call them analogical, or maybe to our ears, poetic evocations of these ideas in the Urantia book. But I think the awareness of God's presence, the awareness of the reality of God's presence was just as clear, maybe not as articulated or differently articulated, I would say. So that's always been a challenge for those who have God in their lives to articulate that balance of inner and outer.
Thank you. As you were talking, suddenly I had an impression that I think hails from my early upbringing when I was being raised as a Roman Catholic. And this is the phrase, quote, the mystical body of Christ. How do you interpret that phrase in relation to the idea of immanence, in relation to the idea of transcendence?
Yeah, well, in fact, in our liturgy every Sunday in my church, we use that phrase in one of our group prayers. And when you say a mystical body, again, that's something that is in some sense without us, beyond us, and just as importantly, within us. And very often when the word mystical is used, it does mean beyond our logical comprehension or beyond our rational comprehension. So when the words mystery or mystical are used, it's just saying, well, this is a reality that we can't really fully understand, but that doesn't make it any less real. So there's a lot of unspoken wisdom or knowledge or faith in that language, and it's kind of a mixture of all three. And you know, I think a lot of my fellow parishioners would really appreciate a further articulation of these ideas. And as of now, they don't have access to what's in the Urantia book. But if it was somehow presented, and I try to do this actually in church, I present these ideas in church. I just don't say where they're coming from. And that makes it a lot easier. And I leave that kind of vague and indiscriminate where these ideas come from, but I bring up the ideas nevertheless. And it's a very valuable bridge from where people are in terms of their belief to somewhere else where they may or may not know where they're going with it. But the ideas are definitely amenable. It's just a language that's somehow different.
Bob, I'd like you to jump on all of this to whatever degree you may find it appropriate. But in doing so, please comment on the revelatory strategy that the Divine Counselor is embodying. He states on the one hand that it is almost impossible for human logic and finite reason to harmonize these two ideas, but nevertheless he puts them in front of us. And I agree with Stephen that they're valid and important. I agree with all of the others of you who've said the same thing. So, but in answering my question, Bob, would you look at the issue of revelatory technique? Is the divine counselor telling us these things because he knows we cannot quite grasp them, or perhaps because he wants to stimulate creative speculation as part of the overall technique of revelation?
Thanks, Neil. That's the approach that I took to respond to this paragraph. Actually, what Andre and George said last week really stimulated my thinking, because when I started to understand a little bit better with Matthew Bloch's work about who were some of the conceptual sources that the revelators used, Charles Hartshorne happened to be one of them, which shows up in the early part of the foreword, and when he talks about the different levels of perfection, absolute, and not perfect, so on and so forth. So I about 10, 15 years ago, I took a little bit of a hiatus in some of the things I was doing, and I got Charles Hartshorne's books. I was very interested because he was such a contemporary. I mean, he only died in the year 2000. And much of his work was based on Alfred North Whitehead, who, despite his neologisms that he uses, like the term prehend, basically philosophized about these two dual concepts that the divine counselor says that we really can't. Well, at one point he says that we can't do it, but at the other point, in the paragraph that George brought up, and I'm glad that you read it. And I'd like to point to that again, that these two essential concepts must be unified in the faith grasp of sensible, and that's a little bit, says my internet connection is unstable.
Bob, we're having trouble hearing you.
And this is the important part, I think, from that paragraph that George brought up. That connection is having a little difficulty. Can you still hear me?
We're hearing you now, but there
Neil,
was part of your earlier comments in which you dropped out.
Yeah, and your image is frozen.
At the moment, your image is frozen, Bob, at least as far as I can tell.
Yeah, I just got a message. I got a message and it said it was having.
You might want to hold your thoughts for a little later if you can
Yeah,
incorporate
you're frozen on me. Can you hear me?
We can hear you
I
now.
have a lot of thoughts.
If you can't move, you can't talk.
Yeah, your audio is erratic and your video is frozen.
Stephen, I think you may be describing a spouse's dream, but I will leave that aside for the moment. Marvin,
Yeah.
you had a desire to interject an observation here. I would like to say something in regard to Bob's earlier remarks before I yield to you. And this has to do with his references to various human authors. For those who may not have been following the Urantia book and discussions about it for quite a range of years, the net implication pertains to what the revelators tell us that they did as a technique in compiling the material. Namely, they drew on the highest human concepts that they could find. This does not mean that the individual human authors are the author of the Urantia book, but that the revelators drew on expressions that they found in human writings for their own purposes. And to my understanding, the general impression of people who have studied this in greater detail than I is that the revelators almost always improved or clarified or refined the wording in the various human authors that they drew on, so as to express the ideas that they wanted to express in ways that would be accessible to human beings because largely similar to something that a previous writer, a previous human writer had expressed. Bob, do you want to go back in this now, or are you not sure that you are fully in touch with our program?
Let me do a test. Testing 1, 2, 3.
You're
Yeah, you're coming across well now.
you got that one out.
Yeah, it must have been just a blip there. That's the first time that's happened in 29 webinars. So I was talking about the second sentence that George brought up, and I think that's the important part. The question that you posed to me, Neil, is the part of it that I had done some thinking about, a little reflecting on it. So while the very first sentence that the divine counselor says, it's well nigh impossible for human logic and finite reason to harmonize the concept of the divine immanence. You know, God is every part of it. You know, God is within and everything of us, with the idea of God's transcendence, as we've just been talking about. But yet, in the same token, in the next sentence, he says it's the most. It's essential, must be unified. So I started talking about Charles Hartshorne and Alfred North Whitehead. These are two relatively unknown individuals, you know, aside from long-term philosophers and or Urantia book, long-term Urantia book students. What's very interesting is that Whitehead preceded Hartshorne. Hartshorne was his student, and he came up with this philosophy of a dipolar God, one that's transcendent and one that's immanent, one that's finite, one that's infinite. So the thinking was already there, which is why I kind of reasoned that the Revelators, you know, knew that we as humanity on Urantia were getting somewhat prepared to be able to handle these two paradoxical thoughts. So let me do one other thing here now. Andre, you mentioned that last week when we read Neil, or I should say Neil read his paper, there was an example there of the Methodist Church, and you called Neil's thought about how to resolve the situation of their split potentially on marriage doctrine as a brilliant line of reasoning. I had to go back and listen to it to make sure I knew exactly what you said. Well, I kind of agree with you also. Neil, you defined the problem as a dilemma, but I think it's a paradox. And I think that the solution that you provided was a solution for a paradox. And let me just put two short definitions out here. First of all, a dilemma is a vexing problem with two possible solutions, neither of which is logically the best. Dilemmas confront problem solvers with either or type solutions, some of which one or the other has an advantage, but neither is really superior to the other. If this approach is taken, the incompatibility of the opposites is accepted, and the strategist, because it's typically done in strategy, is forced to make a choice of one or the other. So this is typically referred to as a duality. Now, a paradox is a little different. It's a situation in which two seemingly contradictory and even mutually exclusive factors appear to be true at the same time. And that's the transcendence and immanence idea that I'll get to here in a second. A problem that's a paradox has no real apparent solution, and there is no way to logically integrate the two opposites into an internally consistent understanding of the problem. So as Einstein said, when he faced the problem of space and time, that you've got to solve the problem at a higher level, meaning that you have to have other information or other data to be able to move the context and to move the understanding of how to come up with an integrated paradoxical solution. So a dilemma presents the problem solver with a difficult task. You got to wrestle with the problems, and going back to the example that you gave, Neil, about the marriage, you gave two solutions, both of which I saw, and I think that's why we all saw that as a brilliant line of reasoning. You solved it at a higher level. I'm not going to go back and actually do that. Folks can take a look at webinar 28 to go see that. Now, getting to this idea of which is in this first paragraph here about immanence and transcendence. And in the next paragraph here, Neil, which we're going to read, you do talk about God the Supreme. That's how the revelators have been able to introduce the Supreme Being to us, which is a concept unto itself, and that's the immanence that we can deal with as it's a finite deity, of course, and we're all participating in that. I'll just leave that at that for just one quick second here. But your two solutions, Neil, were very similar to the solution that both Whitehead and Hartshorne have both written extensively, especially Charles Hartshorne, dealing with the problems of deism and theism. Let me just take one more minute. I know I'm taking a lot of time here, but Western theology basically lives with two basic concepts. You're either a deist or you're a theist. And I want to kind of get back to this whole idea and sort of explain why I'm thinking that this is an important part of understanding the current current theology in the West. Deism believes that God has created the universe, but he stands apart about it, and he permits the creation to administer itself by natural laws. So the deist proceeds for most purposes, at least, as if there were no God, or only an absent one, and it's a short step from deism to atheism with a derivative of determinism and its cousin secularism. Now, many of the founding fathers, they claim, were deists. Jefferson and Madison essentially were deists. Now, theism is a bit more problematic, and it's the larger portion of Christianity. The primary tenet of theism considers the world to be quite distinct from God, yet it makes room for various levels of involvement of God in the world, in the human life. So theism has God determining what happens at various levels. God's in a theistic theology, it goes from hard theism like Calvinism to soft theism, where some of the Catholic theologians, at least the ones that I've run across, are soft theologists. Soft theists, and that God determines some things but not everything. I can hear my mother saying, "Well, those things happen because of a reason," implying that there's some kind of spiritual reason as to God putting his hand into things and making it happen. So as we run from soft to hard determinism, and we've got deism on the top of the coin, theism is on the bottom of the coin, I believe that this paradox is the first part of that sentence by the divine counselor, where he says it's well nigh impossible for logic and finite reason to harmonize these two things. I say yes, because Western theology is stuck on this coin. They flip the coin up and down, and you'll get one side or the other. This whole problem has to be solved at another higher level. And I'll kind of leave it at this to say that that's what the revelation has done for me. It's actually built, starting from the I am to the seven absolutes of infinity, and then moving down to God the sevenfold, which we're going to talk about here in a second, basically resolves that paradox at a level that is almost incomprehensible to most theists and deists. Over.
Thank you, Bob. I have a temptation here to start reacting to some of the things you've said, but at that point, I would be usurping the role of a panelist rather than the role of a moderator, and therefore I will show restraint. Marvin, you asked to speak next.
Yes, thank you, Neil. 2 points I wanted to share. One, we've been talking about God's immanence and transcendence, or the way of understanding God as immanent and God as transcendent. And to me, that has some tie in the theology of the Urantia book to the use of masculine and feminine gender concepts theologically, in the sense that the third person of deity and the supreme are both spoken of in the feminine, and the angelic, the angelic offspring of the third person are spoken of as categorically with feminine pronouns, and the supreme is referred to as our mother, and both of those manifestations of deity are immanent in many respects, are immanent manifestations of deity. So, for instance, the local universe mother spirit, also spoken of as a female depiction of deity or feminine, has mind circuitry, and we are woven into the warp and woof of that mind circuitry by that connection, and that's a profound sense of immanence and connection, in a sense, ground of being. That seems to be associated with the feminine, Mother Nature, in our evolutionary theology. Whereas God is transcendent, God is the other that we relate to dyadically, often is understood as masculine. The sons of God that we relate to and interact with, God the Father as the great other that we are aspiring to the perfection of and heading toward the presence of on paradise, which is the most profound transcendent concept of God. So that's one thought. The other thought is, I want to share a passage with you, and I appreciate Bob's long discourse, partially because it allowed me to find the passage. So here it is. I've just popped it in the chat box. And the point here is, it speaks to the statement in the that you put in paragraph, Neil. It is well nigh impossible for human logic and finite reason to harmonize these two understandings. God is immanent and God is transcendent. And Jesus says this interesting thing here. He says, forget not, it is your personal. I just want to distinguish between the faculties of reason or intellectual analysis, which of course we're primarily using here, and the faculty of faith, which operates on an entirely different level than intellect. Right? Or it interfaces with intellect, but it's a different faculty. And Jesus says, forget not, it is your personal faith in the exceedingly great and precious promises of God that ensures you're becoming partakers of the divine nature. That's an interesting statement, where we merge with God, we consume and take in God's presence, and we become one with God, which is a profound sense of imminent encounter, right? And then he goes on to say, thus, by your faith and the Spirit's transformation, right, which is a non-intellectual function and an outside agency's involvement, the Spirit's indwelling spirits and perhaps the angelic's spiritual transformations, you become in reality the temples of God, and his Spirit actually dwells within you. In other words, the functionality of the immanence and the merging is a result of our faith and the function of spiritual agency, not the result of our intellectual understanding. And so to me, that helps us understand why intellect as a tool is just not going to penetrate the mystery of these realities. These are matters of faith in the exceedingly great and precious promises of God, investing ourselves in these realities, engaging with them, doing them. And then it's fundamentally a result of God's transformation of us based on our faith. That we experience this increasing sense of immanence of God and the merging with God, union with God.
Marvin, thank you for those reflections, which were very rich and very insightful. I do have one element in which I supposedly showed restraint in regard to earlier comments from Bob, but now I'm stuck in regard to you. Your comments about feminine pronouns and feminine imagery are, in my opinion, about 90% correct. For sure, God the Supreme is God the Mother, that's a feminine side. The creative mother spirit of our local universe, the partner of Christ Michael, our creator son, is also referred to in the feminine. And all the descending beings who originate in the mother spirit, notably the guardian seraphim and so on, are used with feminine pronouns she. So the guardian angel, the guardian seraphim is she. But the infinite spirit, however, seems to be referred to with masculine pronouns. And that is because I think the infinite spirit has a side of power and energy and manipulation of the physical domain in addition to the spiritual one. So as far as I can tell in the Urantia book, the infinite spirit is portrayed with masculine pronouns, whereas the creative mother spirit of our local universe, the references to God the Supreme and all references to spiritual beings that descend directly from the creative mother spirit are given feminine pronouns. Now, to some degree, this amounts to a technicality because we know that the pronouns he and she in English and in other human languages, the equivalent, are a convenience for human beings, and that spiritual beings are not gender-based. But in any case, I've tried to do my best with the thoughts you express and clarify them in regard to the infinite spirit as an individual member of the Paradise Trinity. Stephen, it's your turn. You asked to speak.
Yeah, thanks. I just wanted to engage a little bit with what Marvin was saying. So when the book says it's impossible for human logic and finite reason to harmonize immanence and transcendence, there's different kinds of logic. I used the word analogical before. So analogical has the word logic in it, but it is not the kind of logic that we tend to think of in terms of mathematical logic or what you might call linear logic. Analogic in its roots, Latin roots, means around or about logic. So it is in one way logical, it is in one way around, beyond, or what we think of as linear logic. So when you look at a language that was used, for instance, in the Bible, I call that language poetic, but it really is analogical. So in other words, it does engage logic and it does engage reason, but it is not intellectual in our sense. Marvin was talking about faith and intellect. Well, it's also spirit and mind. How are spirit and mind communicating with each other? They communicate, of course, by language. Now, what kind of language are we talking about? Are we talking about purely logical language? No, that's not going to work. We're already told that. And they use the phrase finite reason. Okay, so finite reason and linear logic might be somewhat symmetrical in that way. But when you start talking about analogic, and when Jesus talks about you become in reality the temples of God, so he's using an image there. You know, we are obviously not literally a temple of God in the sense of a building. We're not a building. We're not a temple in that sense. But somehow we are. He says, in reality, we are temples of God. So are we or aren't we? Well, that's analogical. That's using an image to go beyond the, let's say, intellectual meaning of the word temple. So that's why when you asked about a mystical language or the mystical body, that's another form of analogical reasoning. It is reasoning, it is logic, but it's analogical, and it attempts to go beyond what the book calls finite reason. And it's a linguistic strategy, you might say, to bridge the gap between mind and spirit.
Thank you. That's very interesting. I believe you've added to the richness of this discussion. I am going to turn now to the gentleman who contributed the additional sentence in our discussion last week and offer you the opportunity, George, to add additional thoughts if you wish. Everyone who has spoken thus far has agreed with the additional sentence that you put forward.
Yeah, I appreciate all the comments, especially concerning the immanence of God. One of the things that struck me about that following sentence was its emphasis on the necessity of somehow encompassing the concept of the transcendence of God. And at the end of that second sentence, it says you have to have both in order to justify any hope of personality survival. So in the context of the book, that is not considering other religions, but in the context of this book, our destiny is to go to paradise. So that's an appropriate transcendental concept of God, one which is unique to the Urantia book. In Christianity, God is variously seen, well, he's always seen as being outside of time and space. And in medieval cosmology, it was thought that space had a limit and paradise was somewhere outside that limit. And that's how the universe was created from nothing, which is the primary tenet of Christianity, and I assume numerous other religions. In other words, the universe is not a manifestation of God. It's created out of nothing by God. And there's a very significant difference. The second significant difference is that God is not, in Christianity, God is outside of the universe. And that actually fits with Bob's description of deism. In other words, God is off by himself. He creates the universe. It's got its laws and it runs all by itself. That's deism. In theism, it's a little bit, it's less clear, the relationship between God existing outside of time and space and the universe, the material of the universe itself. In the Urantia book, it's unique. It puts God at the center of the material universe so that God is not only transcendent in the universe, existing outside of time and space, but he's actually located at the absolute center of time and space. So it's a concept which is worth pursuing. And Bob also brought up, the contradiction between we can't comprehend the immanence, we can't logically figure out how to connect the immanence of God with the transcendence of God. However, Bob pointed out the book's metaphysics, which starts with the I am, goes through the seven absolutes, through the triunities, down to the, so in other words, we can't do it. Logically, we can't do it, but the book actually does do it. Now, I'm not claiming that we can understand everything about the metaphysics as it's presented in the book. That would be silly. Maybe in 1,000 years we'll have figured it out, but nevertheless, they do provide a revealed metaphysical construct which relates the two. Well, I think that's...
Thank you. I will now yield to the temptation to intervene in regard to the concept theistic, which I agree with you, and likewise with Bob. But I would like to subdivide that word. There is one concept of theistic whereby God on his throne in heaven pulls all the wires and does everything. That is certainly not the perspective that the revelators have given us in the Urantia book. It is a theistic perspective, yes, but they tell us indeed that God, the universal Father, does not do everything, that he has delegated everything that he can possibly delegate, and that his laws, in effect, govern many aspects of practical reality, so that in a way, this is a theistic concept, and now I'm drawing a conclusion myself, that intermixes the respect for natural law that we previously associated predominantly with the deist approach. Now, Andre, you've listened to all of the above. I asked you to read the paragraph because you had spoken last week, but now I'm giving you the final opportunity. I suppose this justifies the description, the cleanup hitter, a phrase that I have used before, and I would submit that the term, the cleanup hitter, is an example of the analogical reasoning to which Stephen referred earlier, because we're not playing baseball and you're not actually going to clean up anything. But here you are, Andre, your turn.
Goodness, I'm not sure I'm going to clean anything up. I just hope to get the rest of you to home plate. I think you've already done admirably well. But among paradox and analogy and everything else, I want to just start with Stephen's wonderful reminder of, well, first of all, bringing to consciousness the idea of the usefulness of analogical reasoning, and bringing up the logical question, is it apt to refer to us as the temple of the Father, or not exactly phrased that way, Stephen, but paraphrasing, it's like, I love to use null hypotheses. And the null hypothesis is, are we not the temple of the Father? If we're not, then that's problematic. Therefore, the aptness of the analogy and the further exploration of the analogy is important. Trying to understand, what did Jesus mean by that analogy? That's, to me, a very, very apt use of analogical reasoning and therefore exploratory reasoning as well. It's very important for us to look at that, and then see if we could then apply parabolic thinking to it as well. Take it away from the allegory and say, okay, so let's realize that in order to understand this, we need to think about it less as a literal allegory and more as, what would, if Jesus were making this into a parable, what might he be trying to illustrate by that parable? So we know, of course, that there are obvious aspects to it, and that is the indwelling thought adjuster as being part of who we are, and then looking at that as some kind of looking at the actual importance of that, looking at how God as immanent is important in our lives. And by looking at some of the things that we know, maybe we could explore again, what Stephen has put forward there. I'd say that if I continued on the allegory, I'd be exhausted pretty quickly. I would want to think about this more than on the fly here in the course of this wonderful webcast. But on the other hand, we do know a few things about what the thought adjuster is doing. We don't know everything, but we know that the thought adjuster is there co-creating us as we are allowing the thought adjuster to do so, as we cooperate with this immanent God, as we choose to do the will of God as a result of this immanent God's leading. We allow God to weave into us a new character aspect that has an actual reality, what the book calls morontial reality, gives a name to the actual substance of what soul stuff is, and says, you now have a new reality in you that's a character reality that is a new aspect of who you are, a self-chosen aspect. So this idea of co-creation, with God, of our better selves to come, is a remarkable truth that might give illumination to whether we want to look at it as an allegory or a parable of what the temple of God is, or what we are as the temple of God. And in that sense, perhaps it's apt to at least say that that temple of God is a temple of life, a temple of new life, a temple of our new and better selves to come, would be a start to that. Now, there are many, many places we could go on this, but I will desist.
Well, first, thank you for all these observations, but I believe that you have taken us to a place whereby it is logical to go on to the next paragraph. All of you have contributed very interesting thoughts, and I will simply say that as the moderator who will be obliged to write a summary of this, you have given me quite a task collectively, gentlemen. Let's go on to the next paragraph. Marvin, would you read it for us? It begins, "Nonetheless, we can acquire." You have to unmute, please.
Yeah, first I'm unmuting, then I'm actually going to the document here. Nonetheless, we can acquire a modest grasp of these profound insights by reflecting that God is the ultimate source of matter, mind, and spirit. This in turn implies that the entire realm of finite reality constitutes eloquent evidence of the active presence of God. To enhance our understanding, we could note that it is the immanence of God the Mother, God the Supreme, that sums up, synthesizes, and cumulates the entire spectrum of finite experience, most assuredly including all the decisions and choices we make while living on our planet Urantia. You want me to go on?
No, I'd like you to stop, please. Thank you. This paragraph, by implication, is partly a contrast between the word ultimate in the second line, ultimate source, and the multiple uses of the word finite that appear later. I'm not sure I realized this when I was writing the paragraph, but I certainly have fastened on it again as I look at it. And so what we have is the supreme God the Mother summing up finite reality, whereas in the first line, in the first sentence, it talks about God as the ultimate source. And now ultimate is a code word in the teachings of the Urantia book for a level of reality that transcends the finite. And that probably is about as much as I can say. But perhaps someone will wish to comment on this relationship or the degree of immanence that we can associate with the finite level on the part of God the Mother. Marvin, I'll come to you later, but I'd like to turn to George first.
Well, that's not an easy question.
I'm sorry, am I supposed to ask easy questions?
Yes, obviously levels of reality, finite, ultimate, absolute. On the other hand, just to make it even more complicated, we have lots and lots of ultimatons right here in the middle of the grand universe, which is a finite domain of the supreme. So they're not exclusive. They overlap both in space. So I guess you could say the same thing has to be true for mind and spirit as well. In other words, these levels of reality interpenetrate in a sense. So the absolute gravity paradigm, the absolute personality gravity of the universal Father actually holds us here. and then they talk about spiritual influences. So it's a very interesting point you bring up, and my way to avoid getting into too much detail is to say that yes, these levels exist together, interpenetrate each other on here. Let's leave it there.
Well, that's good, George. Thank you. And I would say that what you have just said gives added material that Marvin can wrestle with. But in fairness to Marvin, he volunteered to speak before he heard you. And so we will see what he comes up with. Go ahead, Marvin.
I really appreciate you putting me in the hold box there and allowing George to speak first. Because George shared something I find very valuable as part of our discussion, and that's your term of your sense of the interpenetration of these levels of reality, and that defies our logical analysis or rational analysis. So somehow that God is transcended. In other words, God as far away and outside of time and space, even. That's how far away we're thinking here. Somehow God is transcendent, so finds its way into interpenetration with God as immanent, and there is no separation of those two manifestations. It's a single reality that's an interpenetrated reality, and there are hints of that in many parts of the book. And I think I shared in the chat box, there are two statements that to me are representative of that interpenetrative nature of these levels of transcendence and immanence of God, where they say that paradise is the nucleus of every ultimaton. So somehow that reality, which is in a sense furthest away from us, to be beyond time and space, or outside of time and space even, is somehow at the heart and core of every element of material matter. And in a parallel sense, God as Father and as deity in the highest and original sense, somehow in his fragmented expression, is at the very center inside of us, the nucleus of every human person. And in fact, you could say that a person does not continue to exist without that nucleus around which the rest of human personality revolves or coheres. So in a sense, transcendence is the nucleus of the immanent manifestation of God. So the interpenetrated levels of this, I really like that concept.
I really like the fact that I can listen to the recording before I have to sum up what you've written, what you've said, Marvin. We're dealing with very deep ideas. Now, Stephen, I'd like to turn to you and offer you first the opportunity to comment on anything that has happened so far, but also a request for you to address the final half sentence that the decisions and choices we make while living on our planet Urantia are part of the entire spectrum of finite experience that God the Supreme, God the Mother, sums up and synthesizes.
Let's see. I missed your question. I was offline, so I didn't know what your question
Okay.
is.
The first part of it was to say you have a free pass to go in any direction you wish based on anything you've heard or anything else you think of, thought of, but also a request on my part for you to address the final thoughts at the bottom end of that paragraph about our choices and decisions being part of the finite reality that God the Supreme sums up, synthesizes, and accumulates.
Okay. I think when the book talks about God the Supreme as a somehow a interpenetration of transcendent divinity with a synthesis of transcendent divinity and immanent divinity, the image or the word image that comes to my mind is I, thou. Now, I hyphen thou was an idea that was put forward by a Jewish theologian named Martin Buber in the middle of the 20th century. And what that basically says is that the relationship between mortals and divinity is more than cosmological, and it's more than theological. It's personal, it's interpersonal, it's it's a personal relationship. And I think when we use a lot of this language, we kind of tacitly, I mean, we understand that we're talking about personality at some level, but the language kind of covers that up. We are talking ultimately about an interpersonal, transcendental, personal relationship between divinity and mortality. And that is the basic idea behind ancient Judaism and how it's evolved to our understanding in the Urantia book. So I just want to make sure that even though we speak of God the Mother, that when we speak of immanence, we're talking about personal divine immanence and personal divine transcendence in our lives. And that works out in everyday life on an ethical basis of our decisions and how we treat others. And that eventuates in the fruits of the Spirit, which are the fruits of personal decision-making. And that's how the I, thou, the divine transcendent immanence is exhibited in our life. And that's an idea that's been around in some form for quite a while.
Thank you, Bob. I know that in the past you've done a fair amount of study and reflection on the Supreme Being, God the Supreme, and so on. I wonder if you could comment on the ideas contained in the final sentence of this paragraph about the Supreme's relationship to all of our choices and decisions.
Yeah, I can. I was going to talk about something else, but I'll be very glad to answer that because I did have a note there. And the note that I made to myself was, I actually highlighted that, Neil, because I didn't think I agreed with the largesse of that thought about decisions, because the Supreme Being is the culmination of all our decisions, but those are cosmic value decisions that are going to be developed through this grand universe going to light and life. So I don't think all decisions is, it kind of struck me as saying, well, you know, if I learn how to tie my shoes, those, you know, if I make a decision that's a purely non-cosmic value decision, is that something that's going to be summed up by the Supreme? I think not. So that's the only thought I had about that. But yes, in fact, that's probably the first thing that I was in a study group for probably 6 or 7 years, and we finally got to paper 118 or somewhere around there. The papers between 115 and 120, 119 are those that make your head hurt a little bit, because it gets into what we're talking about here today. You know, I remember John Bullock standing up, and we had asked a couple of silly questions about, well, you know, what is this thing, the Supreme Being, all about? And he stood up on the chair and he actually hollered at us. He said, "Don't you know that we are creating a deity?" And I remember looking at, you know, 2 or 3 of the other folks that were in the room and thinking, what's he talking about? Well, that was the catalyst that really drove me to try to understand, you know, what is this concept? What is this finite deity concept that the papers have revealed? And that's why I believe that this whole, you know, this whole discussion here today about transcendence and immanence. Bill Sallard Jr. Used to think of the Supreme as being ubiquitous. But I think, the truth of it is it's both. Immanence is a much more complex term than ubiquitous. I sense that the infinite spirit provides an ubiquitous presence of God, of course, in the finite universe. So that's the only comment I had there about that last sentence. But I did want to make one comment about something that Marvin brought up, and it has to do with the two faculties that you brought up, Marvin, both the faith faculty and the reason faculty. Interesting analogic way to think about them. And as you were talking about this, I thought, well, yeah, that's kind of what we're dealing with here, with what the divine counselor said, that it's well nigh impossible for us to reason, but yet in the very next sentence he says, but you got to do this, and you got to do it by faith. So what came to mind as a picture, because I think that's what we have to do sometimes, is to draw a picture of these things, is a DNA helix that has faith wrapping one way and reason wrapping the other way, and somewhere in the middle is this idea of parabolic analogy gets driven in there as a thread, because we as having both these types of faculties have to really understand, to get through the cosmic circles, to be able to understand how to develop not only our reasoning, because the mind is the arena of choice, and to supplement that, I suppose is maybe a good word to use, with my faith understanding, and that's probably what why the papers, or why we were all driven to the papers, because it allows us to be able to use both those faculties in ways that I never thought I could use them. So I thought that was a really good way to think about that. And then the other thought I had was that George's work on paradise gravity, and the picture that I've always had of the way that the papers 115 to 119 developed this idea of paradise. And yes, paradise is the center of every automaton. But we do know that there is a statement, I think it's in paper 118, that says that paradise is not in space, but it has a location. I think that's how it says it. Let me make sure I got that right. And then space is apparently absolutely ultimate, going back to Neil's thought about, well, how do we match this finite and ultimate? We're talking about some very interesting topics here that you don't have a chance to really talk about very, very much, but this one little sentence has spawned an awful lot of thought about this. And I think that's what the papers do. The last thought I had was that the picture that George presented here today is kind of a picture that I've had in my mind for at least 25 years or so now. Paradise at the center, it's the only unmovable thing in the universe. And it's necessary to be able to position, the master universe and the grand universe in any of the dark bodies, so on and so forth. But the idea that Bill Sadler Jr. had was that the reason for Havona, which carries both the finite and the ultimate, is that it's a nucleus of the cytoplasm, which is the grand universe. When the grand universe goes to light and life, it will be the nucleus of the master universe. And from beyond that, we don't have any other pictures to make. But this idea of nucleus and cytoplasm, which is a kind of an analogical thought to the basic picture of a cell, is quite fascinating, to say the least. So that's from one sentence, a lot of hopefully related thoughts. I know it might sound somewhat unrelated, but these are all related.
Well, thank you. I would say once again that you've given us a menu of very interesting observations. I would focus on one of your observations, which seemed to imply that I should have faith in Marvin's analogic reasoning? Well, I'm not sure I can take a position on that question. Maybe I would have to to abstain if the question were put to me. But in any event, I will now turn to Andre. And before I do that, I would like to clarify the intention of my own when I wrote this paragraph in regard to the final segment of which we have the idea of decisions and choices. It is clear, of course, that it is the thought adjuster who prepares a spiritual, or if you prefer, a Morantia transcript of our decisions and choices. And in writing this paragraph as I did, I was not implying that God the Supreme, God the Mother, does that. Instead, to the best of my understanding, God the Supreme cumulates the net effect of all decisions and choices, including ours, including those of all other human beings on many other inhabited planets. Now, Andre, do I have something here that you might wish to comment on?
Well, there's been so much commented on that it's hard to know exactly where to start. But I liked what George had been pointing to, the idea of the transcendent interpenetrating other realities, including the finite. And I started thinking about it and wondering about that. And so there's an interesting quote that I think at least illustrates some of this idea of immanence and transcendence overlapping and interpenetrating, at least on higher levels. And certainly on the absolute level, we have to suppose that the immanence of God has the potential of coinciding with the transcendence of God in some respects. So what occurred to me, if I can get back there, it's always interesting when you have this many screens open. What struck me as a possibility to illustrate this was the quote about the various kinds of adjusters as they advance through their various experiences. And where they talk about the vanished adjusters, they make an interesting, at least the solitary messenger makes an interesting observation. And he says, for vanished adjusters, here occurs a break in our efforts to follow the careers of the mystery monitors. There's a fourth stage of service about which we are not sure. The Melchizedeks teach that the fourth stage adjusters are on detached assignments, roaming the universe of universes. The solitary messengers are inclined to believe that they are at one with the first source and center, enjoying a period of refreshing association with the Father himself. That would seem to indicate immanence and transcendence. And then they go on, and it is entirely possible that an adjuster could be roaming the master universe simultaneously with being at one with the omnipresent Father. That would seem to illustrate the point of George referring to the interpenetration of levels of reality, not just the ultimate interpenetrating the finite, but even the absolute interpenetrating the finite. And so there's that. There's you want me to go on, or do you want
Well,
is that enough?
I do not have a role of censoring you. If you feel you have additional thoughts that you'd like to share, please go ahead. But if you feel you've reached a logical conclusion, we can go on to the next idea.
Well, I'd say in terms of your paragraph specifically, the aspect of referring to the Supreme summing up, I just want to refer to Bob's bringing up the John Bullock anecdote I think that was just brilliant. That we need to remember that it is not just a one-way street. We become, first of all, there are plenty of places in the book which would indicate that without the supreme being, there's no growth possible in the finite. That means even with a thought adjuster in us, weaving a soul, there's no possibility of finite experience without the supreme. There's no possibility of our soul even having any kind of a genesis, let alone growing into something. And so with all of that, the John Bullock comment reminds us of the reciprocality of that the supreme is growing as a result of our cooperation in this endeavor. And therefore, we're all literally all in this together. We're literally learning how to be team players in this growth of the supreme, which, though being the finite God, has to have a transcendent aspect in order to be conducting this and to be able to do what the supreme is doing in the finite, and then eventually being the repository of the supreme mind, which will eventually have this grand impact in the master universe someday. If that's not absolutely clear, it ought to be in the one comment that is made of the supreme being able to forecast his presence as the imminence of the projected incomplete at some point. You know, that should take away the idea that the finite God is just finite. The finite God is the finite God because of what the finite God is doing in the finite, but must obviously transcend the finite to do that. So.
Thank you, Andre. I think you indeed have added additional thoughts that merit considerable reflection for all of us. But at the same time, I believe you've largely brought us to a successful conclusion to our discussion of this paragraph. Therefore, I would like to continue on with the material on the second half of page 7. And I believe that the paragraph that introduces the list basically should be read with the list. So I would ask Stephen if you would please read that third paragraph from a more analytical perspective, and then continue on all the way through the 7 aspects that are listed underneath it.
Okay. From a more analytical perspective, we will find it exceedingly difficult to reach a balanced and accurate understanding of the presence of God unless and until we transcend the traditional tendency to interpret the word God solely as a reference to God the Father. Not so, for in section 2 of the foreword, a divine counselor declares, quote, God is a word symbol designating all personalizations of deity. Divine Counselor, paper 3.
No, that's page 3. It's
Page 3.
paper 0, which stands for the forward.
Right. Yeah, the forward, section 2, paragraph 6. After several intervening paragraphs, he states that in the 5th epical revelation, the word God is used with the following 7 meanings. 1, God the Father, the universal Father. 2, God the Son, the eternal Son. 3, God the Spirit, the infinite Spirit. 4, God the Supreme Being. 5, God the Sevenfold, deity personality anywhere actually functioning in time and space. 6, God the Ultimate, the eventuating God of supertime and transcended space. And 7, God the Absolute, the experientializing God of transcended superpersonal values and divinity meanings.
Thank you. That's quite a mouthful, and I appreciate your careful reading to get it all out. Some of the terms are hard to pronounce and hard to understand for sure. Marvin, I'd like to start this by asking you whether you agree with the premise in the first paragraph, in the first sentence of the paragraph that Stephen began reading, namely that there is a traditional tendency to interpret the word God solely as a reference to God the Father. Does that seem to be an accurate reflection on in your view?
Yeah, I'm just looking at that carefully again here, Neil. Yeah. Are you asking me if I agree with that
I'm asking
statement?
you whether you agree with the characterization that I've implied in that first sentence.
Yes, I would agree. And I would add a comment. The Urantia book is really sort of unprecedented in my mind theologically compared to all the other theological systems out and around in our world. In the way that it unpacks, differentiates God's function in many different deity manifestations, and yet says God is one, God is unified, deity is unified, and God is unified, despite the fact of those variable manifestations. And this list is one example of that. There's another passage that I wanted to share with folks that really relates to what Stephen was talking about a little earlier, about the I thou, and that is even the Supreme manifests on three different, if you look at the Supreme papers, three different manifestations of the Supreme deity, which is God, the Almighty Supreme, which is more the material manifestation of the universes, if I'm remembering correctly. God the Supreme, which is the personality manifestations and relationship manifestations of the Supreme. And then the Supreme Being, which is the unification of those. So there's that differentiation, which is very germane. But the passage I wanted to share with you all, which is very related, the passage I want to share, which was very related to what Stephen was talking about with the I thou and the relationship focus, is this one. It's 117.6.26, paper 117, section 6, paragraph 26. And they're talking about the Supreme here. When you find the Father, you will find the great cause of your spiritual ascent in the universes. When you find the Supreme, you will discover the great result of your career of paradise progression. So in a sense, God, the Supreme, our Mother, is the great cumulative result or reservoir of all persons in the cosmos and all relationships in the cosmos. So in a sense, my best understanding of it is when we talk about the spiritual family of God, right? All of our cumulative relationships in this web of relationship that God originally, as the I Am, intended and initiated with the inauguration of himself as the Trinity, right? And then proceeded with the plan of creation, all these vast proliferation of relationships, including the manifestations of deity in all of these persons of deity. All of that experience unfolding through time are the cumulative and are cumulatively gathered in the person of God the Supreme. I'm sorry, of God the Supreme, our universe mother, right? Who is really the embodiment of our emerging spiritual family. She is the family of God as it is unfolding and coming into being. That's what I was struck by. So the specific response to your question, Neil, yes, the idea of a single manifestation of God as Father is very simplistic. The Urantia book unpacks it in almost a huge variety of deity manifestation in different beings that are deities. And that God the Supreme, in particular, our mother, is the embodiment of all the relationships of everything that's going on between personal beings, the I-thou relationships, and is thus the embodiment of the living family of God in this universe age.
Thank you. George, I'd like to put to you the same question with a slight twist. In effect, the thesis that I stated in this sentence, that there is a tendency to interpret the word God solely in relation to God the Father, seems to be acceptable, at least it was to Marvin. I would allow you, of course, the option of disagreeing if you wish, but I would ask you to blend into your remarks some reflections as to the distinction between the personal level of reality and the non-personal level of reality, in the sense that we know that God is the source of all matter, mind, and spirit, and whether perhaps this distinction of the non-personal side of reality is partly relevant to the tendency to emphasize God the Father.
Yes, I agree with your as a generalization. I do think people tend to conceive of God as the universal Father. As for, well, more than that, they not only tend to conceive of him as as the universal Father, they also actually really conceive of him as the eternal Son. In other words, there's some confusion. The eternal Son is the absolute personality. The Father is the Father of that absolute personality, which means he can't be anything less than an absolute personality, but he's not the same personality as the eternal Son. So that's as far as I can tell, that's, well, now that I think about it, Christianity incorporates something of that idea in the distinction between the universal Father and Jesus as the eternal Son, even though he's not. But qualitatively, there's a similarity there. The thing that's kind of left out of the concept of God as it's usually presented is the concept of the first source and center, the concept of a first cause, the concept of the first source and center as the I am, which is, I guess, as I've thought about it over the years, in my own mind, I've come to think of the universal Father as the personality of the identity of the I am, the first source and center. That's just my way of connecting the two ideas. I don't know, does that answer your question?
I think you've done as well as I could expect anyone to do with another question that was not easy, to quote you from the previous response. I wonder whether anyone else would like to add to this a question about the relative prominence of relationship to God the Father in terms of the overall concept of God. Stephen, yes, go ahead.
So, like George said, as a generalization, it's probably accurate what you say there in the first sentence. And I'm not so sure that it's incorrect. I mean, it may be factually incorrect in a literal sense, but when one of the revelators, I don't remember which paper, talks about the Christian doctrine of the Trinity and how it places Jesus as the Son and kind of confuses him with the eternal Son. And the revelator says, well, even though this is factually incorrect, it's spiritually correct. And that is more important. And I think it's the same thing here. I think generally speaking, God the Father is understood to be the Godhead of divinity. And Godhead is a kind of a traditional term as well. And I think the book would agree with that God the Father is the source of divinity. And in that sense, it is in some way accurate to use the word God to speak of God the Father. And I also don't think that, at least in Western society, God is understood only to be God the Father. I think in most, if not many, if not most cases, there's also the idea of the Logos, of the second person of the divinity of the Trinity, somehow that God has to be in relationship to his creation. And in very general terms, that's what the Logos is. That's how Jesus was conceived of as a divinity. And that's how the eternal Son is described as a way of God the Father getting in touch with the material creation and the rest of the spiritual creation. So, and then of course, the Holy Spirit, or the eternal Spirit, is the means in which God stays in communication with, and so to speak, spiritually inspires the universe of universes. And I think they're all implied in when the word as God is used, and at least in Western culture, that God is understood as creator and involved in ways that connote the Son and the Spirit as well.
Thank you. I'm aware that Marvin has other obligations that will require him to depart early, in fact, very soon. So I will state for his knowledge and for yours that my plan as the next item of discussion is to ask Bob to put on the screen the passage about the work of the guardian seraphim, but I believe that will take us quite a while, and it would be awkward for, in effect, Marvin to unplug while we are reading that passage. So I wonder now whether you have any valedictory remarks or other remarks that you would like to address to us as you prepare to walk out the door, Marvin.
Thank you, Neil. I don't know if I've got quite something as august as valedictory remarks, but maybe a farewell thought. And that is, it's always interesting for me to make, it's helpful for me to bring these discussions, to bring to the discussions an appreciation of how this is tied to our actual living and immediate experience. And I'll simply say that what we're doing here and what we've been doing for the last hour and a half, and what we'll continue to do after I take off, and is
even more effectively after you leave.
Yes, I'm sure. with great resumption of energy and verve. That all of this is part of our emerging Mother Supreme. That this conversation is a wonderful little part of the relationships we share, the history of the relationships we've shared with each other, and will share with each other, the six of us here and the others listening in a sense, throughout eternity. The trajectory of those relationships are treasures within the presence of our Mother, the Supreme. And she enjoys them and treasures them, and I enjoy them and treasure them. So it's wonderful, Neil, that you've organized this and that we get to do this together. And I find it a treasure. So with that, I'll let you guys go, and I'm sure I'll see you all at the next iteration of our gathering.
Thank you, Marvin. I think you at least came close to the idea of valedictory, so I appreciate your remarks. Bob, I would now like to ask you to put on the screen the excerpt from paper 113 about seraphic guardians. And my motivation here has to do with the idea that the work of God the Spirit is not appreciated as much as it should be, and that the seraphic guardians, in effect, are an example of the functions of God the Spirit that probably deserve to be understood more thoroughly and more prominently. So, gentlemen, I circulated these excerpts to you previously, the excerpts that Bob has now put on the screen. They consist of section 4 in paragraph 113 by the Chief of Seraphim. And I would say that the essential point here as an opening remark would be to take note of the cooperation between the guardian seraphim and the thought adjuster. My observation, by and large, in talking with other readers of the Urantia book and listening to their comments for quite a number of years, is that the inclination to mention the thought adjuster comes very naturally to them and occurs very frequently, whereas the inclination to mention the work of the guardian seraphim does not arise as often, and I think does not involve comments and understanding that are at the same level of depth and significance. So now that Bob has put this document on the screen, I would ask him to read the first 2 paragraphs for us. What I propose to do is to read all the way through this full page, which is to say the 6 paragraphs in that section, section 4 of paper 113, and then ask him to remove it so that we can discuss the ideas before we go on to the second page of these excerpts. So would you please read the first 2 paragraphs, Bob?
Sure. Thank you, Neil. 4, seraphic domains of action. The guardian seraphim are not mind, though they do spring from the same source that also gives origin to mortal mind, the creative spirit. Seraphim are mind stimulators. They continually seek to promote circle-making decisions in human mind. They do this not as does the adjuster, operating from within and through the soul, but rather from the rather from the outside inward, working through the social, ethical, and moral environment of human beings. Seraphim are not the divine adjuster lore of the universal Father, but they do function as the personal agency of the ministry of the infinite spirit. Mortal man, subject to adjuster leading, is also amenable to seraphic guidance. The adjuster is the essence of man's eternal nature. The seraphim is the teacher of man's evolving nature. In this life, the mortal mind; in the next, the Morantia soul. On the mansion world, you will be conscious and aware of seraphic instructors, but in the first life, men are usually unaware of them.
Thank you. Andre, would you please continue on with the next 2 paragraphs? At the moment, I see that you are muted. Does that mean that you are available even so?
Of course it does, Neil.
Okay.
Seraphim function as teachers of men by guiding the footsteps of the human personality into paths of new and progressive experiences. To accept the guidance of a seraphim rarely means attaining a life of ease. In following this leading, you are sure to encounter, and if you have the courage to traverse, the rugged hills of moral choosing and spiritual progress. The impulse of worship largely originates in the spirit promptings of the higher mind adjutants, reinforced by the leadings of the adjuster. But the urge to pray, so often experienced by God-conscious mortals, very often arises as a result of seraphic influence. The guarding seraphim is constantly manipulating the mortal environment for the purpose of augmenting the cosmic insight of the human ascender to the end that such a survival candidate may acquire enhanced realization of the presence of the indwelling adjuster, and thus be enabled to yield increased cooperation with the spiritual mission of the divine presence.
Thank you. George, would you read the final 2 paragraphs, please?
Yes, there we go. While there is apparently no communication between the indwelling adjusters and the encompassing seraphim, they always seem to work in perfect harmony and exquisite accord. The guardians are most active at those times when the adjusters are least active, but their ministry is in some manner strangely correlated. Such superb cooperation could hardly be either accidental or incidental. The ministering personality of the guardian seraphim, the God presence of the indwelling adjuster, the encircuited action of the Holy Spirit, and the Son consciousness of the Spirit of truth are all divinely correlated into a meaningful unity of spiritual ministry in and to a mortal personality. Though hailing from different sources and different levels, these celestial influences are all integrated in the enveloping and evolving presence of the Supreme Being.
Thank you. There's a great deal on this page that we will have an interesting time discussing. Bob, would you remove this screen sharing so that we can go back to the original format, please? Thank you. Now, I assume that all of you have this material available. I circulated it to you before. And so I would like to start by asking about the material in the first paragraph of the section that distinguishes the work of the seraphim as occurring in mind, whereas the work of the adjuster occurs in the soul or within the soul. Why is this relevant? Why is it important? Bob, would you take that?
Why is the differentiation between the seraphim, where they're promoting circle making decisions, and the adjuster? I see the adjuster as working in the mind, weaving the soul based on our superconscious value decisions that are cosmically oriented. So this matter of fact, I think you highlighted that first sentence, that second sentence there, Neil.
Yes.
Yeah. All seraphim are mind stimulators. In fact, if we think about the master seraphim, they're mind vocalizers, ideational clearinghouses, and project promoters. So they're working in mind. There isn't any, or I should say, working with mind, while the adjuster is working in our mind, developing the soul. Because the thought adjuster is actually, they tell us that the thought adjuster is resident in the mind. He invades our mind. So where's the mind? I see the mind as a field. We've got cosmic mind. We've got the Nebudonian creative spirit, adjutant mind spirits. And all of these are, and as they say in this paragraph, all of these are working in concert. So the mind is the arena by which all of this operates. And a mind is a terrible thing to waste, isn't it?
Thank you. I would now ask Stephen to focus on the implications of the phrase working through the social, ethical, and moral environment of human beings. This seems to put the seraphim more or less in a social role, or at least in a social context, whereby the implication, as far as I can understand, is that they are helping us deal with the reality of other human beings and the surroundings that we have in society, or if you prefer, in association with other persons. Do you understand it that way?
Yes, yeah, generally speaking. The idea that came to my mind first in talking about the role of the guardian seraphim and mind and working with the external environment is providence. Now, providence is an idea that is actually fairly prevalent in the Urantia book. And of course, it's an idea that's been with us throughout most of Christianity and even in the Jewish tradition prior to that. I'll just read a few quotes here that I just pulled up. Throughout all these millenniums, Providence has been working out the plan of progressive evolution. Providence is always consistent with the unchanging and perfect nature of the supreme lawmaker. The Paradise Trinity has ordained the universal order of progress, and the providence of God is the domain of the conjoined creator and the evolving supreme being. There is operative throughout all time and space with regard to all reality of whatever nature, an inexorable and impersonal law, which is equivalent to the function of a cosmic providence. The inexplicable things of life are still termed acts of God and mysterious dispensations of providence. So I see the role of the guardian seraphims as somehow implicated in the outworking of providence in the universe of universes, and what the interconnection of that relationship is. I don't think we're told in any real detail. I think it's a fascinating subject, how the action of any one given guardian seraphim in an individual's life is somehow tied up with the master plan or the God the Supreme, or however you might want to term it. But it goes from the universal to the individual through the outworking of providence and the actions of the guardian seraphim in our lives, or with our lives. Actually, should be with our lives. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. I think we are not going to be able to have an exhaustive discussion of every idea on this page. My intention really is to highlight the role of the guardian seraphim as epitomizing the function of God the Spirit in the context of understanding God as presented on the page of my essay, Living the Real Religion of Jesus, that we're discussing. But Andre, I would like you to go down another couple paragraphs in the excerpt to the sentences that read, "To accept the guidance of a seraphim rarely means attaining a life of ease. In following this leading, you are sure to encounter, and if you have the courage, to traverse the rugged hills of moral choosing and spiritual progress." Does this mean that the seraphim are always asking us difficult questions, in the phrase that George used earlier?
Well, I would lean toward the answer yes, although I think there's an element of mercy in these wonderful ministers, and that they probably don't always tax us all the time, but in the main, they're interested in our growth, and therefore, I think the simplest answer is yes. I think we can all reflect on our own lives and think of many things that have occurred in our lives which were not necessarily welcome on the face of them, but which, after having gone through those experiences, we look at the experience with the benefit of hindsight, and we understand that by going through that experience that we would not have necessarily chosen to do ourselves, we are better people for it, and better capable of handling the next tasks that have come in front of us.
Thank you. George, let's go down one more paragraph. I'm interested in the statement in the middle of the third paragraph from the bottom. The guardian seraphim is constantly manipulating the mortal environment. And it goes on, for the purpose of augmenting the cosmic insight of the human ascender, and so on and so on. But what does this mean? The guardian seraphim is constantly manipulating the mortal environment. Is this a violation of human free will?
On a simplistic level, it would be, but obviously that's not what's going on here. I think it ties into what was said at the top of this section, which is the seraphim are always trying to stimulate our thinking to promote circle making decisions. So as I interpret that, I believe that means, in the context of your question, they're always arranging things so that we are constantly presented with moral issues, upon which we need to make decisions, because those are the kind of decisions that contribute to the growth of the supreme. You know, choosing a cup of coffee or a cup of tea doesn't contribute anything to the supreme, but moral decisions do. So how they manipulate, I have actually no idea. You know, at some point in the text, it says that I found it, but I've forgotten the exact reference, that sometimes thoughts, occasionally, not very often, but occasionally thoughts that suddenly appear are actually the direct work of the adjuster. But they also say more often than not, it's just your subconscious mind. But so the seraphim do not like insert thoughts into our mind. In fact, even the master seraphim don't do that. They elevate or enhance or make appealing certain ideas that are already present in our mind, but they don't just interject thoughts. But on occasion, thought adjusters apparently do. Now I've sort of talked myself away from the question. Let's see. I think
We seem to be losing George, who is now freezing, perhaps in reminiscence of Bob's earlier adventures.
my conclusion is yes, but
All right.
yes, my internet connection is unstable.
Okay. Well, anyway, did you feel that you'd reached an end of your remarks?
Maybe. I have no idea, since I don't know what you didn't receive.
I think we'll leave it there if you don't mind. I would like to turn to a sentence in the next paragraph as a vehicle for asking a question to Stephen. And the sentence I'm interested in this particular case is the statement, the guardians are most active at those times when the adjusters are least active, but their ministry is in some manner strangely correlated. Now, my curiosity has to do with what are these times? When is it that the adjusters are least active? And therefore, the times likewise when the seraphim are the most active.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Well, I guess it has to do with the particular individual at particular moments being more internally aware of the promptings of the adjusters, and the adjusters have priority in taking advantage of that inner motivation or that inner awareness. And I would guess that that takes priority over the seraphic guardians. It doesn't really say that, but it just says that they're correlated. And then sometimes our people are or need to be more aware of their surroundings. And maybe at that particular moment, it's more important to be aware of your external environment. And that's the best way for you to move forward spiritually in service of the Supreme. So that that interaction, that correlation, I agree, is not accidental or incidental. I would call it providential. So that may be a hint as to somehow how providence works in the operation of the adjusters and of the guardian seraphim. That may be one outworking of what the book talks about when it talks about providence. So that's interesting from that perspective.
Thank you. Andre, I'd like to continue on this particular idea and pose to you the possibility that the times that are implied here when the adjusters are least active, but the guardian seraphim are most active, partly might be at least some of the difference between being awake and asleep.
Yes,
Are we
it does.
talking possibly about the concept that the seraphim are extremely active when we are awake and conscious and making choices, and that the adjusters are extremely active in creating the transcript, the Morantia transcript of our decisions when we are asleep? Is at least that possible?
Yeah, I think you're correct in your interpretation of the teachings that way. And it's not that the adjusters aren't doing anything, while we're awake, but they do refer to the idea that we're much less able to interfere with their work when we're asleep, which I love. I think that's wonderful. It's the idea that, okay, it's like looking at babies, aren't they adorable when they're sleeping? um, so yeah, I would agree with you there, and their work would largely be during that sleep of trying to weave into not only our soul, but trying to make whatever transformations they're able to make in mind that they would be able to make as a result of the decisions we've made before. There were a couple of things, the concept that had been brought up earlier about free will, and I think it was George that was making it, but I can't recall, was nicely dealt with in terms of the seraphim by this quote about the law forecasters, which indicates that these supervisor seraphim are busy making sure that any law that is made in the constellation does not infringe on moral free will. Elsewhere in paper 110, they talk about the thought adjuster in the same vein, that they never do violence to our free will, but respect it. So it's between those two things. Our free will, we have very little idea as to how it best functions. We really don't understand it fully as a reality on its own. This is a fairly novel, or it's a concept that is losing currency in our current discussion of mind and urology, where mind is assumed to be entirely based in the neurology of the brain by most of science today, and is given very little correlation with anything that science cannot explain. Certainly no spiritual aspect to that, let alone the idea of free will. And yet the seraphim and the thought adjusters understand that we are not predetermined creatures. We are creatures that have free will. They both respect it, but they both, within the realms of our free will, choose to move us in directions that we would assent to ultimately. And therefore, it's important for us to get our free wills on board with the idea of, I want to do what my thought adjuster wants to do with me, even though I may not be able to imagine it. And likewise for our seraphim.
Thank you. I would think now that it's best to move on to the final paragraph, which is a paragraph that I highlighted in its entirety because it correlates very strongly with the thesis that I was portraying in the second half of page 7 of the essay, Living the Real Religion of Jesus, about the interrelationship and mutual reinforcement of all aspects of deity. Therefore, I shall simply read this paragraph myself as a repetition. The ministering personality of the guardian seraphim, the God presence of the indwelling adjuster, the encircuited action of the Holy Spirit, and the Son consciousness of the Spirit of Truth are all divinely correlated into a meaningful unity of spiritual ministry in and to a mortal personality. Though hailing from different sources and different levels, these celestial influences are all integrated in the enveloping and evolving presence of the Supreme Being. Now, as I was saying when I was trying to introduce this paragraph, this effectively epitomizes the idea of the unity of spiritual presence of God in all of the different aspects that the divine counselor identifies in section 2 of the foreword, and that I reproduced at the bottom of page 7 of my document. I'd like now to ask Bob to turn to the second page of the document that I circulated and put it on the screen for us, please.
Neil, can I make one comment about that last paragraph?
Sure.
We were talking earlier about the use of the term God, meaning deity. What we didn't talk about was the definition of divinity, and that's the quality of the unity that that deity has. Of course, the supreme being is unifying at this very moment. But I thought about in this last sentence that all of these spirit realms are divinely correlated, which means that the individual is trying to unify, or I should say, all of these spirit realms are trying to help the individual divinely correlate these spirit realms. Doesn't mean that we're going to become divine even if we get to the first circle, but I thought that that was interesting that they used the word divinely correlated, which of course means the quality of unity of the deity. So a lot going on in that particular paragraph. So let me put this up here now. Figure out where I got it here.
The second page.
How we doing?
Not yet.
Oh, sorry, didn't hit the share. Okay.
Good, thank you. I will clarify Bob's version of this because the highlighting on the first page was mine. This highlighting appears to be his, which is not an objection, but
I apologize. That is mine. You are correct.
But just a difference for everyone to understand. Now, having put it on the screen for us, Bob, I wonder if you could read the whole text for us now.
Sure. The higher human races of Urantia are complexly admixed. They are a blend of many races and stocks of different origin. This composite nature renders it exceedingly difficult for the monitors to work efficiently during life and adds definitely to the problems of both the adjuster and the guardian seraphim after death. Not long since I was present on Salvington and heard a guardian of destiny present a formal statement in extenuation of the difficulties of ministering to an immortal subject. This seraphim said, "Much of my difficulty was due to the unending conflict between the two natures of my subject, the urge of ambition opposed by animal indolence, the ideas of a superior people crossed by the intellects of an inferior race, the high purposes of a great mind antagonized by the urge of a primitive inheritance, the long-distance view of a far-seeing monitor counteracted by the nearsightedness of a creature of time, the progressive plans of an ascending being modified by the desires and longings of a material nature, the flashes of universal intelligence canceled by the chemical energy mandates of the evolving races, the urge of angels opposed by the emotions of an animal, the training of an intellect annulled by the tendencies of instinct, the experiences of the individual opposed by the accumulated propensities of the race, the aims of the best overshadowed by the drift of the worst, the flight of genius neutralized by the gravity of mediocrity, the progress of the good retarded by the inertia of the bad, the art of the beautiful besmirched by the presence of evil, the buoyancy of health neutralized by the debility of disease, the fountain of faith polluted by the poisons of fear, the spring of joy embittered by the waters of sorrow, the gladness of anticipation disillusioned by the bitterness of realization, the joys of living ever threatened by the sorrows of death. Such a life on such a planet. And yet, because of the ever-present help and urge of the thought adjuster, this soul did achieve a fair degree of happiness and success, and has even now ascended to the judgment halls of Mensomnia. Solitary Messenger from paper 111, section 7, paragraphs 4 and 5.
Thank you. Before Bob removes this from the screen, I would like to comment that this is an example of extremely effective writing. His highlighting demonstrates all the verbs or participles that embody contradictions or at least contrasts. And is an example, I think, of very effective composition that attracts our attention. The ability to attract our attention by rhetorical purposes or by procedures that can be understood to be literary is a highlight of the Urantia book as a whole, but I think it is particularly evident in these two paragraphs ascribed to a solitary messenger who is quoting the guardian seraphim of this particular subject. All right, Bob, could you take this down, please, and return to our discussion mode? I would ask for comments on the extreme prominence of this quotation ascribed to a guardian seraphim. It is a guardian seraphim speaking, not the thought adjuster speaking. And of course, we cannot say what a thought adjuster would declare, but it is extremely notable that the revelators have quoted extensive remarks by a guardian seraphim. George, do you draw any conclusion from that?
Well, I mean, it's very, very interesting. But just to clarify that in another section of the book, it does give a rather extensive quote from a thought adjuster to his personal subject. So it's not merely seraphim that they quote, they also quote thought adjusters.
Thank you, yes.
But I mean, other than that, I mean, it seems it's a remarkable statement. It's very straightforward in its it appears very straightforward in its honesty of the difficulties involved in trying to get off this planet alive.
Right. Thank you. Stephen, what do you take from this series of very fluent comments by the guardian seraphim?
I take it as a very, I guess you might use the word emotive depiction of the Supreme and the struggles of the Supreme. I mean, the Supreme is the attainment of the Supreme Being is a struggle, to put it mildly. And I think this really kind of embodies this in a very, well, I'll just use the word emotional way. I mean, there's a lot of emotion in this statement, and which to me is very meaningful because it quote unquote humanizes the guardian seraphim. And I think if the guardian seraphim was not in some shape or form, well, I guess in an analogical way, human, this could not be communicated in this way. So it really does speak to, again, poetically, the human nature of the Supreme and the mortal struggle that is part of the Supreme. So in that way, I find it very meaningful.
Thank you. Andre, does this passage or perhaps the preceding page that we read heighten your understanding of and appreciation for the role of God the Spirit and God the Spirit's descendants, the creative Mother Spirit, and for that matter, the guardian seraphim?
Well, I suppose in a certain sense, I'm more struck, especially by this last, paragraph that I think you aptly described as excellent, an excellent literary piece. It really does grab our attention and contrast for us how we are viewed from an outside perspective, and what it is that they're actually dealing with. But it's not all bad. It could be, they could have easily just focused on the negative here, but they don't. They say, listen, there's this positive stuff going on. you've got the training of intellect, annulled by instinct. You have flashes of universe intelligence that are countered by the chemical energy mandates. It really does strike me just what they're dealing with here as difficult. But just being in these human bodies, we understand it ourselves. We understand what it was, for instance, all of us here, not to focus on our lack of youth, but we all understand as younger men what it was like to be alive and how many decisions might have been counteracted by some chemical energy mandates at that time. So, they're making a good case for us to become a little more conscious of our consciousness, and to realize that we have choices to be made about which way we go in terms of which part of our nature we feed and allow to give expression.
Thank you. I will now offer an opportunity to anyone who wishes to add a comment on the understanding that we are nearing the end of our very interesting webinar today. I see Bob. Go ahead.
Thanks, Neil. I did highlight all the verbs because I've read this we've all read this paragraph, and I've heard it on CDs, and it's just almost like poetry. I looked up the word extenuation, and here's what I made for the note up there: explanation, justification, apology, vindication, diminution, abatement, and mitigation. So the first time I heard this, and the paragraph that was introduced talks about the guardian of destiny making a formal statement of one of these definitions of this word. Either an explanation, a justification would be very interesting, an apology would be even more so, a vindication, maybe it's all of it. And I guess the first time I read this, I was struck by the fact that, yes, here's a guardian of destiny who's speaking on an individual in Salvington. And I thought, well, is the guardian seraphim making an apology that she couldn't do her job really well? Or was she saying that, look, this individual did pretty well, and it's a vindication because of all these hardships that your ranching people have to go through? I don't have the answer to that, but that was what went through my mind, and why I wanted to see the verbs is I was kind of interested this time in thinking about some of the verbs are really strong, like the training of an intellect is annulled by the tendencies of instinct. So this individual, would that verb have been used for someone else, or would the training of the intellect have been opposed by the tendencies of the intellect? I don't have a lot of answers, but that was what went through my mind and why I highlighted all those verbs. Thank you.
Thank you. I would go back just briefly to your identification of the initial word extenuation. In extenuation, extenuation certainly is not the same as saying as an excuse, but it's probably a little bit closer to as an explanation or as a mitigating explanation. So I think looking at this logically, the seraphim is not apologizing, but rather explaining the difficulties that she had and the challenges that she had to overcome. And thankfully, her satisfaction that her subject did overcome these difficulties with some help on her part. Well, gentlemen, does anyone else wish to address us today? Otherwise, I will.
Just a quick comment.
Yes,
And that
Andre,
is
go
the
ahead.
last statement. This soul did achieve a fair degree of happiness and success, and has now even ascended, etc. the use of happiness and success, I think, are deliberate. I mean, happiness is quite obvious, but it refers specifically to what we hope to gain by spiritual growth. But success is measured in any number of ways, but the one way they measure it in the adjuster papers is by mastery of the psychic circles. That mastery of the psychic circles harkens to success. And so we ought to be aware of those two measures in looking at this final sentence here.
Thank you. I believe you have the last word substantively. I would state to you, gentlemen, that my intention when we begin next week is to offer an opportunity to comment on these 7 persons of deity that the divine counselor has identified, and offer you the option of remarking however you wish. And after that, we will go on to the top of page 8 of my document. So, gentlemen, once again, I thought this was an extremely interesting discussion we had today. I have, once again, a challenge of writing the report, but fortunately, I don't have to do that this evening. So I wish you the best, and we will be back together again next week. Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Hey, bye, everybody.